Imagine waking up every day to a nightmare, not knowing if you'll survive until the sun sets. Picture the terror of feeling trapped in your own home, where every glance from your husband is filled with rage, and every word from his lips is a warning. For years, Sarah Thornton lived that nightmare. But on one fateful night, as the man who had destroyed her was passed out drunk on the couch, something inside her snapped. This is the chilling and heartbreaking story of Sarah Thornton, a woman who was pushed to the edge and finally fought back. In the quiet town of Atherstone, Warwickshire, a house stood, a house that looked like any other. On the surface, the world saw a young woman, a mother of two, living a life of quiet domestic bliss. But inside, the walls were stained with fear and tears that no one could see. Malcolm Thornton, a man of rage and alcohol, had made their home a battlefield. He wasn't just violent, he was unpredictable. And with every violent outburst, Sarah's hope for a life of peace slowly died. This is the story of a woman who was broken by the very man she had married. A woman who fought back in a moment of desperation. This isn't just a story of murder. It's a story of survival. A story of a woman pushed beyond her limits, struggling to break free from a violent past. Before we begin this journey into the past, if you value stories that honor the victims and seek to understand the full picture, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join a community that believes every voice deserves to be heard and every story told with respect. Sarah Thornton was just 24 years old when she found herself suffocating in a marriage that slowly chipped away at her sense of self. At that young age, she had already become a mother, trying to raise her two children in a home that was supposed to be her sanctuary. But what should have been a safe place was far from it. Instead of feeling the warmth and comfort of family, Sarah's life had become a battleground, one where violence, fear, and anxiety ruled every room. The man who once promised to cherish and protect her had become the very thing she feared the most. The love she once felt for Malcolm had turned into a daily dread she could not escape. Malcolm wasn't always this way, of course. When they first met, he was everything Sarah had dreamed of. He was charming, thoughtful, and full of promises about their future. His words made Sarah feel safe. He told her she was the one for him, that they would build a life together. They married quickly, swept up in the whirlwind of love and hope, and soon after, Sarah was pregnant. The excitement of becoming a mother should have been one of the happiest times of her life. But as soon as the wedding bells faded, the first signs of trouble began to appear. It started small, with occasional arguments that felt uncomfortable but not alarming. But soon, Malcolm's temper began to grow. His alcohol consumption increased, and with it, his anger grew deeper, more unpredictable. As the months passed, Malcolm's behavior shifted from bad to worse. The anger that once simmered under the surface began to explode. He would lash out at Sarah, sometimes verbally, sometimes physically. His violent outbursts were no longer just isolated incidents. They were becoming a regular part of their life together. The love and affection that had once defined their relationship were now buried beneath a mountain of fear. Every day, Sarah tiptoed around him, trying to avoid triggering his anger, unsure of what would set him off. She was no longer the woman who dreamed of a peaceful family. She was a woman in survival mode, living in constant dread of the man she had married. For years, Sarah didn't know where to turn. She was trapped, unable to escape from a man who had transformed into a stranger. She couldn't turn to her family, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know the full extent of the abuse. She tried to protect them from the truth, not wanting to burden them with the weight of her secret. Her friends didn't understand. They saw Malcolm as the charming, funny man they had all once known, not the monster Sarah had come to fear. And with two small children to care for, leaving felt impossible. Where could she go? How could she start over? These were the questions that haunted Sarah, and each time she thought about leaving, she was paralyzed by the uncertainty of what would happen next. Sarah tried to fight back in small, desperate ways. She sought help from authorities, but every time she reached out, it felt like no one truly understood the gravity of her situation. The police would come, but they couldn't see the emotional scars, the terror that gripped her every day. She wasn't just living with a violent man, she was imprisoned by the psychological toll of constant abuse. Each time Malcolm's rage exploded, it chipped away at her, leaving her with nothing but a shell of the woman she had once been. Her cries for help were met with indifference, and every attempt to escape felt like running into a wall. Over time, the walls of her emotional prison seemed to close in tighter. Sarah couldn't get away from the man who had claimed every ounce of her strength, and yet she felt too weak to fight back. Every plea for help, every effort to escape, seemed to only make things worse. And the worst part was the loneliness. No one truly understood what she was going through. She was a mother trapped in a violent relationship, and yet the world around her was oblivious. The emotional, physical, and mental weight of living like this began to wear Sarah down, leaving her feeling as though there was no way out, no escape, no hope. By 1989, Sarah's life had become a never-ending cycle of fear and pain. The young woman full of hope and dreams that she once was had all but disappeared. Instead, Sarah was a shell of herself, exhausted, emotionally drained, and struggling to hold on. Every day was a fight to survive, and with each passing year, she felt herself slipping further away from the woman she had once been. The woman who believed in love, in safety, in a future full of possibilities. Now, all she saw in the mirror was someone who had been broken by the constant violence, and she began to question whether the woman she once was even existed anymore. She was trapped, and she didn't know how much longer she could endure. As time passed, the cracks in Sarah's marriage deepened. Malcolm's behavior became more erratic. His drinking had escalated, and with every drink, his temper grew more unpredictable. The violence that Sarah had lived with for so long turned more vicious, more frequent. Sarah started to withdraw emotionally, building walls around her heart as a form of self-preservation. She no longer saw Malcolm as the man she once loved. Instead, he had become the embodiment of everything she feared, a monster who could turn on her at any given moment. The once hopeful woman who had tried so hard to make her marriage work now found herself fantasizing about a life without the constant abuse, without the fear that came with every glance from her husband. And in her mind, Tony began to represent that escape, a life that seemed possible if only she could find the strength to break free. But Sarah couldn't leave. Not yet. She was caught between the desire to escape the violence and the overwhelming fear of what would happen if she did. Where would she go? What would happen to her children? The cycle of abuse was all-consuming, and no matter how badly Sarah wanted to break free, the fear of leaving kept her rooted in place. She thought about it constantly, about what her life could be like if she could escape the man who had caused her so much pain. But leaving meant risking everything. And so, Sarah stayed, trapped in a marriage that was killing her, unable to break free from the cycle of violence and fear. One night, after yet another violent argument, Sarah reached the breaking point she had been avoiding for so long. It wasn't the first time Malcolm had come home drunk, slurring his words and picking a fight over something trivial. But this time felt different. His body, lifeless and slumped across the couch, seemed detached from the man he once was. The rage, the insults, and the fear that had become her everyday reality were all flashing through Sarah's mind. His presence no longer felt like a husband's embrace, but a monster lying in wait. Every slap, every bruised moment, every night of terror that she had endured over the years had led to this one heavy moment. Malcolm, in his drunken stupor, was no longer the man she married. He was a threat, one that had crushed everything good inside her, leaving only a hollow shell behind. Sarah stood in the doorway of the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of the years of abuse was suffocating. As she watched Malcolm, unconscious and vulnerable on the couch, something inside her snapped. She couldn't take it anymore. The knife on the kitchen counter caught her eye. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, a cold metallic weight in her grip. Her thoughts were scattered, her emotions chaotic. She didn't want to kill him. She didn't want to end his life. She never thought it would come to this. But in that moment, as her mind raced and her breath hitched, Sarah didn't see her husband. She saw the man who had broken her over and over again. He was no longer just an abuser. He was a predator, and she had become the prey trapped in his cage. Her only thought was survival. She had to protect herself. And in her heart, she knew there was only one way out of the hell he had created. With the knife in her hand, Sarah stood over him. Her entire body shook. Her mind screamed at her to stop. but something more primal, more urgent, told her she couldn't. The years of torment and helplessness consumed her thoughts. She wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting to regain the dignity, the peace, and the safety she had lost. As the cold steel of the knife pressed against Malcolm's flesh, Sarah was no longer just a wife. She was a woman pushed to the edge, clinging to the last shred of her humanity. In that instant, she didn't just kill her husband. She killed the woman she used to be. The woman who believed in love, who thought she could save him, who thought she could escape without consequence. That woman had died years ago, buried under the weight of the violence she endured. Now the woman standing in front of him was someone who had nothing left to lose. The moment the knife made contact, everything blurred. Sarah's vision, her thoughts, everything around her turned into a swirling haze of fear, anger, and shock. The flood of emotions hit her all at once: guilt, rage, disbelief. But there was no time to process it. It wasn't just the act of stabbing him, it was the culmination of years of pain and brokenness. It was her attempt to take control of a situation that had been beyond her for too long. But even as she stood there, with the reality of her actions sinking in, she couldn't grasp the weight of what she had just done. Her breath was shallow, her hands shaking as she dropped the knife to the floor. The world felt unreal, like she was standing outside her own body, watching herself as she took that final, irreversible step. In the aftermath, Sarah was left to face the consequences of what she had done. There was no turning back. There was no undoing the moment she had crossed the line. As Malcolm's body lay in front of her, Sarah couldn't find the words to explain what had happened. She wasn't proud of her actions. She never wanted to kill him. But what had she been left with? A lifetime of violence, of fear, of silencing her pain for the sake of keeping the family together. The rage, the fear, the hopelessness had consumed her. And now, standing in the stillness of her home, she realized that everything she had known, everything she had built, was now shattered. The consequences would come, and there was no escaping the legal system. But for the first time in years, Sarah felt a strange sense of clarity. She had survived, but at what cost? Sarah was arrested the night of the stabbing, and though the world saw her as a murderer, she was far from the cold-blooded killer the prosecution portrayed her to be. She was a woman who had been driven to the edge by years of abuse, her mind and body pushed beyond their breaking points. At her trial, Sarah pleaded guilty to manslaughter, arguing that diminished responsibility due to the trauma of sustained domestic violence had impaired her mental state. She didn't want to take Malcolm's life. She wanted to protect hers. But despite the years of suffering she had endured, the jury didn't see her as a victim. Instead, they convicted her of murder, and Sarah was sentenced to life in prison, her future now locked behind bars. As the gates of the prison closed behind her, Sarah was forced to face the harsh reality of her situation, her past, her abuse, her desperate plea for escape. It all seemed irrelevant to the legal system that had condemned her. In their eyes, she was just a woman who had killed her husband. The years of torment, the psychological scars, and the toll of enduring a marriage filled with fear were dismissed. In prison, Sarah wasn't just serving time for her actions. She was serving time for the life she had been forced to live, and the injustice of it weighed heavily on her soul. The pain of her sentence was compounded by the fact that her own suffering was invisible to the world that had cast her aside. But as time passed, something within Sarah began to shift. Prison, for all its harshness, became a place for her to start rebuilding. At first, she struggled with the isolation, the constant reminders of her crime, and the overwhelming sense of being trapped in a system that didn't understand her. Yet behind those cold steel walls, Sarah found a way to survive. She sought solace in books, devouring anything she could find that would distract her from the ever-present weight of her circumstances. Reading became her escape, a way to transport herself out of the confines of her cell and into worlds of knowledge and imagination. She started writing as well, pouring her thoughts, her anger, and her grief into the pages of journals that no one would ever read. Sarah also attended therapy sessions, where she began to confront the trauma that had shaped her life. Slowly, the woman who had once been so broken, so full of fear, started to heal. She learned to face the wounds that had been hidden for so long. understanding how the years of abuse had shaped her actions and responses. Over time, the woman who had been shattered by violence began to rebuild herself, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that courtroom, but she was learning to accept the person she was becoming, stronger, wiser, and more at peace with herself than she had ever been before. After years of campaigning by women's rights groups, Sarah's case was finally referred to the Court of Appeal. The new evidence, which highlighted the psychological toll of the abuse she had suffered, was enough to reopen the case. The emergence of expert testimony about dissociation and battered woman syndrome, conditions that had not been adequately recognized during her initial trial, brought her case back into the spotlight. In 1996, Sarah was retried. The jury, now understanding the extent of her trauma, found her not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter. With over 5 years already served, Sarah was released from prison. The legal system had failed her in many ways, but this was a glimmer of justice, a recognition that her suffering had been real, even if the price of that recognition had been high. Sarah's release from prison was a bittersweet moment. Yes, she was free, but the scars of her past, both physical and emotional, would never fade. The years of abuse had reshaped her in ways that no prison sentence ever could. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that courtroom. The woman who had emerged from the cold, institutional walls of the prison had been forged in pain and survival. She had learned to mask her wounds, but the ghosts of her past still lingered. She had gained freedom, but it came with the heavy weight of everything she had lost and everything she would never regain. While Sarah had been released physically, the peace she so desperately sought remained elusive. What she wanted was to rebuild her life, to find some semblance of normalcy after the chaos of her marriage and prison. But the toll of those years had left its mark on her. Peace was a foreign concept to her now. It wasn't something she could simply reclaim after years of mental and emotional imprisonment. Though she was free from the bars of the prison, Sarah knew that true freedom, freedom from the trauma, from the memories of abuse, from the haunting legacy of her marriage, was something she might never find. After her release, Sarah transformed the pain of her past into a powerful tool for change. She became an outspoken advocate for battered women, sharing her story with anyone who would listen. No longer a victim of the system that had failed her, she became a voice for the countless women trapped in abusive relationships, struggling in silence. Sarah's case became a symbol of the inadequacies within the legal system when it came to understanding the full scope of domestic violence. She spoke out about the years of abuse she had suffered, the mental toll it had taken on her, and how the legal system had failed to protect her when she needed it most. Her efforts sparked crucial conversations in the UK about how domestic violence survivors were treated in the courts, challenging existing laws and raising awareness about the psychological impact of sustained abuse. Sarah's advocacy work didn't stop with public speeches or interviews. She worked tirelessly with organizations that supported survivors of domestic violence, helping to create resources for women who felt as trapped as she once did. She partnered with groups like Justice for Women, pushing for reforms in how the legal system handled cases of domestic abuse. Her experiences, both as a victim and a survivor, gave her a unique and invaluable perspective. She used that perspective to educate lawmakers, law enforcement, and the public about the complexities of abuse, arguing that the legal system needed to better recognize and address the effects of long-term trauma on its survivors. Sarah became a trailblazer, one of the leading voices in the fight for justice for battered women. While Sarah's work was instrumental in raising awareness, the emotional aftermath of her past was never far behind. Despite her newfound role as an advocate, the scars of her own journey haunted her. She had spent years living in fear, years locked in a psychological prison, and while she fought for others, her own healing was an ongoing process. Sarah would never completely escape the trauma of her past, but she found purpose in helping others break free from their own chains. Her story continued to inspire countless women who saw in her not just a survivor, but a champion who had turned her pain into power. So, what do you think? Was Sarah Thornton a murderer, or was she a woman who had been broken by the system she trusted? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, share it, like it, and subscribe for more stories of survival, justice, and the fight for women's rights.